Hold on, see if I got my recording going. All right, so I think it's recording. Anyway, so this is an NN4DA discussion about authorizer evaluations. Before we dive in to our four panelists, some of whom are internal and some of whom are external, how about if we just go around and everybody introduce themselves? And by way of introduction, could you also say, in your state, does somebody evaluate authorizers? And if so, who and why? But try to do that in a short way, and we'll all sort of get up to speed on the extent of evaluating. So Lauren, you go first.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lauren Iannuccilli. I'm a consultant. I'm also the Incubating State Partner Facilitator for Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania does not have any kind of authorizer evaluation currently. And I've participated in authorizer evaluations, largely state-driven in Ohio, Minnesota, and Tennessee, and formative in Indiana.
Great. Tim, you go next.
I'm Tim from the Wisconsin Resource Center for Charter Schools. We're a technical assistance program, and we do not have any sort of anything like this for our authorizers. However, I was on a call with our Department of Public Instruction recently, and it looks like legislation is moving forward to start creating some sort of evaluation for authorizers, but what that actually looks like is being kept very quiet right now. So I do not know what it looks like, but I have a feeling we're going to be the ones that are also involved in the process of actually creating it, because it'll be ambiguous. So
great. And Michelle, Tennessee.
Hi, everyone. I'm Michelle Doane, based in Nashville. I'm also the Incubating Partner Facilitator in Tennessee. In Tennessee, we do have a formal evaluation. It's written in law. Authorizers are evaluated every 2 years by the State Board of Education. I've also, just in terms of other authorizer evaluations similar to Lauren, I've also worked in Ohio, Minnesota, Indiana, Maryland, a whole bunch of others with Lauren and with Dave.
Great. And Kelly.
Hi, I'm Kelly Cadman. I'm in Georgia, and I'm with Hive 180 Educational Consulting. And we do have a state authorizer evaluation that's just brand new. It's actually been around for about 2 years, but it hasn't been implemented. So we're trying to figure it out here in Georgia.
And Marianne in Florida.
Hi there, Marianne Blair, Executive Director of FACSA, one of the primary states, and we do not have an authorizer evaluation. There has been, I think, some talk about it, and so we're trying to get ahead of that effort. We've been talking just because of NACSA and listening to our partners talk. I thought, well, we should probably start with a self-assessment and just see where we are. So that's where I'm kind of wanting to hear, what are you evaluating and why, so that then we could build something as kind of pre-evaluation if we ever get to that place.
Craig, you want to go next?
Sure. Can you hear me? Craig McVeigh, Oklahoma Public School Resource Center, the authorizer liaison, and have no real idea. So I'm here to learn, and I'll be just listening in.
Great. Welcome, Craig. Mackenzie.
Hey, everybody. I'm Mackenzie Edie of CACSA in Colorado. Hey, William. It's good to see you. We do not have an evaluation system. I do think it's both of interest and also potentially in discussions in the future. So we're also trying to get ahead of it, just like Marianne stated for Florida, and we're in the stage now where we're just trying to better understand the current status of how authorizers are operating generally in the state, so that we can figure out how to navigate it if it's coming our way.
Great. David, you want to introduce yourself and where you're coming from?
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is David Hartman. I lead Venn Education. I am in Minneapolis and had the opportunity to work with William many, many years ago to implement the first authorizer evaluation process here in Minnesota. But like Lauren and Michelle, have worked in Ohio, Tennessee, prepped in Missouri for their new process, but then also done formative evaluations for many authorizers who are looking for continuous improvement.
And you're available to help people with that through Venn Education, correct?
That is true.
All right, not a paid sponsorship opportunity, but just knowing that there are other professionals out there. Speaking of that, William, you're next. Where are you coming from? Tell us about your authorizer evaluation.
I'm William Haft. I run Tandem Learning Partners. Hi, everyone. Alex, thanks for having me in this conversation. And nice to see some of you again, Mackenzie and Dave, and meet many of you. I have been running Tandem Learning Partners, which is education consulting, largely with charter schools and charter school authorizers. Since 2017. Before then, from 2002 to 2017, I was on the leadership team at NACSA. I ran the authorizer development division, which was the hands-on work with authorizers, including relevant to this conversation in the late 2000s. There were conversations happening around authorizer accountability. Minnesota, one of the first places, as Dave mentioned. And NACSA was in a leadership role by default. At that time, the principles and standards were established. Folks were looking to them as definitive on what it means to be a quality authorizer. So NACSA was going to have a leadership role. And the question was, one question was, if we play a more hands-on role, what does that look like? And the choice was really, I guess, threefold. One was do nothing. One was play a summative role, which we did a little bit working with departments of education on evaluating authorizers and saying, yes, you are qualified, or you meet the bar wherever that bar is, or no, you don't. Or more formative, doing the hands-on work with authorizers directly. Here's where you are, here's where you're strong, here's where you can improve. And my feeling, for a bunch of reasons, was one, that it probably couldn't be both of those things realistically, and two, that it should be the latter. It should be, for NACSA, the formative work. So we piloted that work, including with Alex in Colorado, with a handful of authorizers, and then got funding in 2010 through the charter school program, national activities, funding to do 10 of those a year. And they were all voluntary. Authorizers needed to say, yes, NACSA, we want you to do this. And through 2017, when I stepped down from NACSA, we had evaluated, done something like 75 evaluations of authorizers, all types and sizes across the country.
If I may summarize, we have on the call an incredible brain trust of people who've been involved in the authorizing evaluation business for the last 20 years, and including supporting states that have summative evaluations that are designed to, I will say, something that doesn't happen as much, but push out really bad authorizers who are doing it for the wrong reason, as well as lead authorizers to improve basic practice, as well as a ton of more formative evaluation. So with that setting, and knowing that our NN4DA partners are they're thinking about it primarily from formative purposes, and they are trying to stay ahead of summative and formative evaluations that others would inflict on their members or participants. And so in some cases, I will add, the formative evaluation is really helpful to figure out what to improve, but many of the districts we're trying to engage through the NN4DA are relatively unengaged, and they feel like they're in hostile political environments. So doing a formative evaluation is scary to them, because they feel like the information will be used against them in litigation or an appeal. So I guess my first question for our four panelists, and Lauren, Michelle, David, and William, is, if you think about advising us, how would you steer us towards the right purpose for evaluation? And why would you pick a particular purpose, and what implications does that have for how you would do evaluation? William, you were starting with that. You want to go in a little bit more in terms of the purpose of evaluation and what advice you have for us?
Depending on the circumstances, I think if there is a framework or there's clearly going to be an evaluation from above, let's say from a state board of education or state department of education, then realistically, I think your primary purpose is previewing that evaluation. There can certainly be a formative component to it, but it's like if you're going to get a test, you want to prepare for the test. And so if I were thinking about working with someone who's in that position, then to me, that's the reality of the situation and the practice. And it's not a bad thing. Presumably, if it's a reasonable structure for how that evaluation is going to be done, there can be inevitably a getting better at things that the authorizer could get better at as part of that work. So I think it can be beneficial to have that, but that would be, so that would be the orientation in that case. If it's to just purely get better, if it's not in the shadow of some framework, then it can be purely formative, and that just gives you more flexibility to say, in addition to some standard array of things that we're going to look at, here's a particular thing I'm struggling with or want to get better at. So you just have that much more flexibility to tailor it.
It's helpful. For those like Michelle, Lauren, and David, you've all recently worked on those summative evaluations for some of the states. Based on that experience, what else do you think happens when a summative evaluation exists, and how does that influence what we should maybe do with our partners? Thinking about, the Tennessees and Georgias or Minnesotas.
I'll start. Others can dive in. I think summative evaluations are a huge lift for authorizers. It involves submitting hundreds and thousands of pages of documents, and it's very time consuming, particularly for smaller authorizers with minimal staff. So I think when we're thinking about, how do we best help our about wanting to self-reflect and participate in self-improvement, I think we need to start from more of a place of really strategic, thought-provoking questions, potentially more qualitative, intentional reflection points for authorizers, and have it be less heavy on documentation and defending, are you meeting a standard or not? Because that's certainly where it seems like a lot of the summative state-led evaluations have gone. And I think it's not necessarily the right starting point for kind of work on evaluation, particularly for our states.
Yeah, I would add to that, Lauren, I think you're right. I think what we have heard from authorizers in those states as well is it's a huge lift. And I think they then lose sight of the ultimate purpose, which is continuous improvement. It's really about trying to show them these are the best practices, and that's what these standards are based in. And then they start seeing it really just as a test that they need to ace. And that can become a big burden for the authorizers. And so they see it, they lose sight of the fact that it's about continuous improvement, and they are just trying to kind of get to those criteria. So, one thing I think that is good as well is to make sure that you are building relationships with the authorizers as well, that you are able to have that open communication with them too. So it's a two-way street with that. I think what we found in some places is there is not always that dynamic, and that can make it even harder for whoever then is trying to administer the assessments, whether it's formative or summative, and the authorizers could be then kind of more resistant to that. And I see Mackenzie, yeah.
You got a question there, Mackenzie? Go ahead.
I don't know if I'm allowed to ask a question yet, but
yes, go ahead.
For the folks that already have systems in place, I'm just curious, have you seen it actually improve the quality overall of the authorizers? I mean, because I'm coming from I have never experienced this kind of a setup or any kind of structure. So in my mind, if it's done to us, it would appear that it's some kind of like, right, accountability regulatory thing, but I feel like there could be really great value in it. And I'm just wondering, do you see that? Like, is there evidence of that? And how do you manage that, navigate that, all the things?
David, you want to go first?
Yeah, I'll start on that. And the answer is 100%. Like improvement, absolutely standardizing practice. I think of it in terms of professionalizing the practice, just to make sure that there are minimum standards that exist. I mean, so I think Alex or William talked about the attrition that's happened in some of the states. Like in Ohio, when we first engaged in the review, there were 70 plus sponsors. Now there are 22, I think, or maybe 18. Michelle might know better than I do.
Down to 18.
Yeah, Minnesota was over 50, and now it's down to, I think, 13 that exists. And that's not to say that you need to like get rid of them. It just set a standard. The other thing is that the ones that remain now have a full array of tools. They've started to think about implementation of those tools. And having worked in Minnesota in sponsoring before they became authorizers with the process, like the language has completely changed across the authorizing environment in the state. People just know what they're talking about in the intervention protocol or, a renewal protocol and expectations for that. Those conversations never existed before that state standard.
Anybody else want to respond to Mackenzie's question?
And I'll just add, I mean, it's like two sides of a coin in terms of like the load and the lift, but I would say in Tennessee, it's been really impactful to see for the small authorizers that only have one or two schools and were maybe doing nothing or didn't even know what authorizing was. Like they have a full suite of activities now that they are doing, and maybe they needed that carrot of a state requirement, but it's worked. I mean, it might be keeping them up at night and creating a lot of anxiety, but it is making them implement tools, have better oversight, engage with their schools in ways they might not have done, right, if that law was not on the books.
One thing that'll just add with that is that the evolution of some of these evaluation processes, Minnesota, who's been at it the longest, has revised their process over time, and it's become arguably less cumbersome. It is still huge. But there's less ask for those fundamental documents, like what's your application process? What is your contract template? It is more about like, how do you implement and what is the quality of it? They had to go through that first phase to standardize the tools and all of that before then. Now they can focus on higher level things that kind of get to quality in a much better way than originally, like the structure of the evaluation was.
Well, I guess I would, let me ask, and maybe this is a question for William to start with, because it's getting back to the depth of your experience and the numbers you dealt with. What is the translation of the evaluation processes you've done it for a small authorizer? So a bunch of our state partners, they have some big and medium authorizers, but they also have these authorizers where it's a 0.05 staff assignment, and we're giving them the bad news that they need to put some resources into it. Can you speak to like how does it change for what you might call a tiny and we would call a small authorizer?
One thing that one really helpful role that a state department can play when it's, or Board of Education, when they're in this role, is to have models and templates. So I think of Tennessee as a really good example where you've got, Memphis, Shelby County Schools, which I do a lot of work with, and they're one of the largest authorizers in the country, and they ought to have, pretty well developed, robust systems in place. They need them and they should have them. And then you've got district authorizers with one or two schools, and it's not realistic to expect the same. And where, the state of Tennessee levels the playing field, Missouri's done this as well, is model application, model resources, so that an authorizer obviously can tailor those, a large authorizer as needed, but a smaller authorizer can adopt those, and it's just less of a lift to get those things in place that Dave was talking about. And
It's
then
not old address.
Focus more on the practice.
Well,
My next door neighbor.
Sorry, Kelly, we're hearing you there.
20 years ago.
Kelly, you're coming through on your audio a little bit. Let me leverage that each of our state partners and our theory of change into producing, this suite of model materials that's supposed to be there. And one of the questions that's come up for me is thinking through like the NACSA 12 essential practices, which NACSA doesn't necessarily promote anymore, but that end up touching on like 8 of the tools, versus the NACSA principles and standards, which get to sort of high level functions like, can you discern quality and can you hold them accountable? And are you infringing on autonomy? What do you think the difference is between sort of approaching it from sort of tools and saying, what are the artifacts you have in place versus what are the functions that you have in place? I'm curious for anybody to speak to that, because we're in the business of creating model tools, but then we're trying to get into the business of having everybody use them. And then it's not the same. Any thoughts on tools versus principles from anybody?
Originally, William, I think when we were working together in Minnesota, you made the distinction between established and implemented, and that the rubric for evaluation was originally written with some of that terminology to make that distinction. So established are the tools and implemented is the process. And I'm not sure that, well, it is much easier to implement if you have effective tools. That doesn't mean you have to have the exact tools to do it. However, you need to be able to fill the responsibilities, right? Have a contract that meets the marks on some of the state statutory requirements and things like that. But again, it was an evolution over time. And so, Alex, to your point about working with individual districts or states, it's, you kind of have to have the toolbox in place before you can really start talking about and engaging in, and people need at bats, frankly, to work with those in order to even engage in a conversation. One of the first application reviews in Ohio, there was a submission for what is your application that you use for the process, and they submitted a student application for the district. They didn't even understand the tools that they were being evaluated on. And, that was embarrassing for them, but just, shone a light to kind of the wide array of, just knowledge that existed and why that process was actually needed so badly to be implemented there.
Anybody else on the distinctions?
I think I'm thinking about how understanding what districts are currently doing helps then say, well, we have a tool for that, right? Or it's like already there. I think you want to know what's actually happening in terms of authorizing activities to then be able to help with technical assistance from NN4DA or someone else, or internally helping them prioritize what they want to work on. So personally, I kind of like the idea of a tool that asks questions related to practices or helps really think about what am I currently doing that, oh my goodness, there could be like big repercussions for this. Like if I'm not ready for a closure, like God, all hell could break loose, right? If one of my charters that I have no oversight of closes tomorrow, right? So I think potentially starting from a place of asking about practices, then you can fill gaps in when things are not happening with model tools that states already have or high performing districts within a state are using. Because I think just saying you need all these things can get a lot of superintendents and district leaders really overwhelmed. Like they want to know just more concretely, like, what do I need to be doing and how can you help me do that? So I don't know, I guess for me, it's maybe a little more practice over tool first.
Anybody else?
Yeah, yes, I would agree with Lauren. It's always important to have tools because when we talk to authorizers, we always say it's important for you to have these things documented in case you are not there tomorrow. Can someone in your office pick up and keep going and keep everything, all of your processes going? But a lot of them too, I mean, you also have to have the practice in place. And a lot of them have not had the time to do that because they are just going, and they have to get these things done. But it's really, I think, thinking about what are they doing? And also, I think it's helpful to have model tools. I know for me, a lot of the authorizers that I've worked with, they always want a model tool, right? Can you just give me this tool? Can you just give me this resource? But I think what the challenge and the danger of that can be is that, as we know, there are so many different contexts. There's so many different rules and regulations, all of those sorts of things. And so, yes, we can have these model tools, but they have to know how to use them and also how to adjust or adapt them as necessary to make sure that they're fitting within their own context. So it's a combination. They need to have the practices, but they also need to have that tools to make sure that there's that institutional knowledge within their office.
And I would just say, as an example of that, like reflecting on doing authorizer evaluations, a lot of times like newer authorizers, they'll just do an annual report, give some color-coded ratings, right? But what are you actually doing to give those ratings? Like, are you just having the school tell you they have a compliant enrollment process, or are they actually taking steps to understand how kids are let into that school? So I think if we want to actually have a sense of what authorizers are doing, it's really important to actually understand their practices and not just like a tool they think they should be using. And even if like, are they using it the right way?
Well, let turn over to our other state folks who've been a little more quiet and get a sense of your reactions to this discussion so far. Anybody with a general reaction or a sense of, I can't wait to do that, or that'll never work in my state? What are you guys thinking?
When we're talking about the context of formative versus summative, what does that really mean? So is formative just like a self-reflection, and then like summative is we could fire you?
That in its most extreme in these other states, summative can mean you are no longer an authorizer and your portfolio has to go somewhere else and you get shut down. Versus a formative is it's up to you to improve, and here's feedback you can use to help guide that improvement. But the summatives also, I would argue that Colorado has a summative evaluation. They just don't think about it, in that someone could challenge your exclusive chartering authority in front of the state board and say, you're a bad authorizer. You should no longer have a right of denying me going to the state authorizer. So summative can be everything like from Colorado, where it's this ephemeral thing in the background, to Minnesota sort of kicking you out of the business, more or less. And the people are afraid of having summative implications sometimes. Is that fair for those of you doing summative evaluations? I didn't overstate that too badly.
I think that's fair. I think most are structured, I guess I would liken it to intervention protocols that, you all use with charter schools, in that it is not you're fired, but there are multiple years of documentation of, evaluations over time and continuous improvement processes in order to do it. Of course, the fear is, maybe to Alex's, like a state board that basically changes their philosophy and just kind of uses their authority in order to kind of clean house, or just decide against an organization that didn't approve or didn't renew a certain school that they wanted. I haven't seen it work that way. And so it's not as terrible as it may seem. However, yeah, I mean, formative is much better to like take control of it for yourself.
Other questions or reactions? Tim?
I'm definitely surprised to hear that you feel in general like it's been positive. And I say that from two perspectives. One, we have school report cards, and they're just always a controversial thing in Wisconsin because this year they changed all the metrics and they lowered the bar, and it's been all over the news, and really great schools are upset because Milwaukee is ranking as high now as some of our other schools because of all the metric changes. And so I wonder about the metrics always of what are we assessing? And so I appreciated the whole concept that you'd brought up before of it's important to know what you're being assessed on. It's important to know how we are really being judged and what under what criteria and what standards. I know that our Department of Instruction in Wisconsin feels like or Department of Education feels like it's the Wild West in Wisconsin with authorizing, because there's no metric. And so I completely agree there should be a metric. I guess I was surprised to hear you guys say that it really has been effective, and it's encouraging to me because we don't want to see something coming to play that's going to really put negative pressure, but put positive pressure on our authorizers to actually up their game.
Well, I would give a bit of ancient history. While part of William was doing that work, I was leading the policy and advocacy work for NACSA for some of that time. And we were working in states to support authorizer accountability, which would lead to some of these evaluation schemes and accountability schemes for the authorizers. I use schemes in the not bad plotting way. But what I don't think people appreciate now historically is that 15 years ago, we were dealing with some pretty unscrupulous authorizers or ideological authorizers that were not committed to quality or appropriate oversight in any way. So some of them were doing it absolutely for the money, or because some governor told them they should approve those schools from that friend who was being treated meanly by an authorizer who had rigor. So we were trying to police a form of authorizing problem that isn't as big a deal as it used to be. So there aren't very many of those authorizers left in the country. And instead, we're dealing with under-resourced authorizers, or in particular in the NN4DA, districts with turnover, districts without enough staff resources, districts without knowledge, and very few ideological districts that are giving everybody a charter who wants one who shouldn't be in the sector. So that's like part of this infrastructure from Minnesota, Michigan, Ohio was set up to police that unrigorous authorizing, not in order to formatively improve small districts doing authorizing. So that's just an historical lesson for me. It's good to know that like we sort of solved that problem to a pretty significant extent. And we're now thinking about this in a different application where we're trying to get people to become a good authorizer in the sense that they're not saying no to good applicants, or that they have their pieces in place, which is totally different than the problem some of this was designed to solve. William, how does that resonate with your experience on the ground side of those years?
Completely, in terms of how this authorizer accountability conversation originated and where it originated, and in terms of how it's happening in the context of districts, also makes me think about the challenge of knowing how to use the resources. And Michelle, you spoke to this too. It's right. It's not just having the resource, it's knowing how to use it. And the same applies for whoever's doing the evaluation. So you've got a State Department of Education that has often a lot of turnover. I know this has happened in Missouri, has been a challenge for authorizers there, and feeling like, yeah, the State Department is doing this evaluation, but they have no institutional knowledge about what an authorizer is supposed to be doing. And there's kind of a constant, and I think probably needs to be anticipated, and maybe a role for this organization in educating whoever's doing the evaluation on, here's what and why, here's the purpose of it, and what you could or hopefully should be looking for in doing this kind of evaluation.
No, that makes sense. I think that's part of where you heard several people say they want to get out in front of this and they want to influence what might happen to them. But there's others who are trying to do it for a technical assistance heuristic. And, I know, William, your team was often, once they finished the evaluation, they then helped the district or the authorizer with a problem. Anybody from the field thinking about how to link this to their fee-for-service work or their technical assistance as like a 1-2 punch, like, hey, you do the self-assessment and then let's talk about what you need help with? Anybody thinking about that?
So in Florida, sorry.
Go ahead, Marianne.
In Florida, we just started to gather our fee-for-service, kind of that, not fee-for-service, but really how much work that authorizer is putting in based on the percentage of the amount that's taken from the charter schools. And so the state is starting to gather that information. So I think it could be tied to, hey, let's evaluate this because this amount of money is coming from the charter school and provided to the district. So it's kind of along those lines, I think.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that in terms of resources, because I think a lot of people, when they first get into the idea of aligning to a standard, is they just make more, right? They just see it as more. And so going through the evaluation process, actually, you can start to identify some areas in which you potentially are overworking, like you're doing more work in a particular area. I mean, I would say that it helps if you start to think about like prioritizing academics over compliance, right? And so but it's a trap for many, and I would actually say district authorizers who are more focused on compliance, to actually send out their staff who have specialties in special education, facilities, finance, and those types of things, rather than take it at a higher level, and actually have some economies of scale and efficiencies that they can employ. So the self-evaluation in the formative sense can, if done right, or really kind of with the concept of thinking that you could eliminate some either redundancy or fat in your process, doesn't always have to lead to more. And then, Marianne, maybe in your instance in Florida, right, you can say, you know, we're proactively trying to use those funds that we encumber from schools in the most effective way. I mean, I've heard of authorizers who rebate, you know, a certain amount at the end of their year, in order to kind of demonstrate that they're only using their funds for authorizing purposes, you know, to do that type of fiscal responsibility if you're in a climate in which people are questioning that.
Yeah, the other, we have states with different levels of transparency. We also have just this, I guess one of the problems I bring to people's attention is that's unique in the district setting, more so than non-district, is all authorizers suffer from turnover. The districts suffer from like 5 times more turnover than the non-districts. It is so frequently a low-level assignment that's not a plum job, and it just goes from person to person. And so that's where the systematizing of tools becomes a more important element of our theory of change, of influencing districts, than it is for the larger ones. Tim or Mackenzie, anybody want to speak to like how this might help with the turnover of the district folks?
Oh, I think it would be great. I mean, the handoff is where everything falls flat, because in our district, I mean, we have 90 district authorizers, 92 in Wisconsin. And so it's every time we have turnover on boards, which, you know, across the country, I know is the same as Wisconsin, we're seeing superintendents that are the liaison really. And they're turning over every 1.5 to 2 years right now throughout Wisconsin. So the ball just keeps getting dropped, and systematizing it would be great, because that is a hope of ours to do within our organization, is to help that process, whether there's an evaluative component or not. We need to systematize the process of, you're the new liaison, here's where we begin, and getting them to build up their capacity. So yeah, it's a huge problem.
And I would just say oftentimes the evaluations then lead to, you know, improvement plans or strategic plans, which then serve as nice roadmaps and documents for turnover and new staff to say, these are our goals, the direction we're moving in, these are the priorities for our work. And then NN4DA can be there to swoop in and help with technical assistance related to those priorities. So yeah, I certainly think it can help with change in staff.
That's good to hear.
Let me shift us to a different question in terms of process. Several of our groups are thinking about it as a self-assessment. Others would be thinking about it as sort of a third-party thing. And part that deals with the numbers, like we're dealing with California with 230 districts, and Tim's got 90, right? And then you go to Tennessee and there are 7. So you could do it for all 7. There's no way you could do it for 230. What do you think changes when you go to a self-evaluation? And, you know, what sort of thoughts do people have to make self-evaluations meaningful and engaging? Any advice?
I mean, off the top of my head, I really struggle with self-evaluation if it's not external third party, right? If it is purely and that, I think Lauren can vouch, in an evaluation process in which we're currently engaged, there is a self-reflection that is part of the document submission. And what we commonly see is that the highest score is identified in every column, right? Regardless of the quality of the documentation or a narrative that supports it. So there is not an incentive for people to be honest in that particular situation. And so it's challenging to kind of talk about the ethic. I think getting to a professionalization, like if you're doing it in isolation, then of course you're going to protect your own space and try to not do it. And so what you're doing and opening up like statewide conversations and people being able to lean on each other for resources, they start to get some idea of how they perform relative to others. And I think that helps the process tremendously, but it doesn't eliminate it. I mean, the state that we started with like has that going on. But it's a really, really tough thing because, yeah, I mean, most people say like, am I good at what I do? And most people say, yeah, I wake up, and I'm happy and proud of what I do by the end of the day. Like that has nothing to do with quality.
I think the external perspective part of that is really important. In the early days of NACSA, for the first iteration of the principles and standards, we developed some self-evaluation instruments. And they never really got much traction. And then the evaluation process did include a self-reflection, but it was always a pretty high level. It wasn't a self-rating. It was more, I wanted to use it to get a sense of where the authorizer was mindset wise more than anything else. Because, I guess the example of the extreme example, hopefully, of an authorizer doesn't recognize that application means, their process for a school to apply as opposed to a student application. That's hopefully an extreme. But, if they don't know that, then how can they possibly evaluate themselves, or how can their evaluation of themselves be valid? So I'm agreeing. I think that it's a limited resource. Most useful to me in conjunction with, or maybe as a precursor to, the external evaluation.
And then, go ahead, Lauren.
I was just going to say, and I think that's the conundrum, because I think it's those very authorizers, right, that like wouldn't even know how to respond to a self-reflection or would answer that everything's swell, that we really want to come to the table and really understand their practices and what they're doing and what more they could be doing. So I think if it's through, like, we've been working on a template with really provocative questions, right? To get light bulbs say, oh my gosh, I need help, right? A way to get them to see the benefit of doing more, engaging more. And so I think if we can think about other ways besides, I feel like how we've seen self-evaluations or things just simply tied to standards, if we try and put a spin on that, maybe we can really try to get some folks to have those aha moments of, I need help, right? I don't have the tools and practices in place that I need.
But how about if we marry this, and Kelly, maybe you can speak to this in Georgia. What if we marry it to the threat of the state evaluation? Can you get someone to go through a self-evaluation that makes them anxious about, and and leverage the stick a little more? Maybe that's a question for both Michelle and Kelly in places where there is a state evaluator or one threatened. What do you think?
Well, I've just started this process, and so I'm trying to work through it. And it's good to hear your perspective on the self-assessment. I do think that they are more willing to come to the table to do a pre-assessment. They haven't. They've been willing to come to the table to do it. And what I've been trying to do with them is to have them help develop this self-assessment and take them through sort of a protocol for that makes them almost like reflect in the moment on their practices and discuss it amongst themselves, and then build the tool to take back to redo it again with their documents and things like that. But sort of like forcing the conversation, forcing a lot of the reflective work and norming across all the authorizers in that moment. Do you understand what I mean? And we're building the tool as we go. So it's like a two-step reflection process. And then hopefully after they've gone back to self-reflect with their documents, then coming back to share out their findings and their gaps and where their needs are. So I don't know how that's going to work. We're giving it a try.
Well, no, that sounds like a really good group process that leads them both to develop the evaluation, but to discuss it amongst themselves as So there's some professional community leading also to shared expectations that you wouldn't get in a pure self-assessment for sure, and leveraging the process of just creating it.
Well, I mean, and I feel like, if we could get a process where it's every year they do this together, they renorm every single year, it just becomes a part of that professional learning community. It's not really something being done to them. It is just a part of that learning process. Like in a classroom when people are constantly coming in to review it, it's just part of what you do. So I'm hoping that is what we're setting up there.
Yeah, I would say that the interview process associated with authorizer evaluations often is a really formative process. If people get, like, if you establish good rapport and it doesn't feel like a gotcha type situation, where you can start to ask the questions in terms of like, here's the outcome that is sought from this particular practice or this particular tool, and people can kind of engage in it that way. So Kelly, I understand, what you're saying about in doing it, but that's, labor intensive. So it takes a lot of people and time. The other thing too that Tennessee does with their evaluation is they have non-evaluation year authorizers participate on the teams with the external evaluators. And so they get to peek into the other authorizers' documents and listen to the consensus discussions. And, I know that, many of them have noted when I've seen them, at conferences outside, they're like, oh my God, that was so valuable to just kind of understand the level of scrutiny and why those things are important or not important. So like how you just team things and whether it's not just internal or external, but try to do both.
And there's some models in other aspects of education where that sort of group cohort reviewing each other becomes a learning and norming experience that leads to raising the standards for other aspects in public ed. So that's something that districts may have some relevance with. So.
Yeah, and to add on to that, so also in Tennessee, so when the authorizer is going through the evaluation, they do have complete a self-reflection as part of the process. So they kind of go through, self-reflect on all of the standards. They can point to what evidence they think is within the documentation to support whatever they're saying. But then in their non-evaluative years, they also have to complete a self-assessment that is submitted to the state board. So every year they're doing something towards it. So it's still on their mind. They're still kind of having to think through it each year. They typically do it every other year. If an authorizer receives an exemplary rating for 2 consecutive evaluations, they are then exempt from the following one. But even in those years, they would still then complete that self-assessment. So they're not completely out of it. And that way there's still that touch point. And then to what David said, that they also have the opportunity to serve as a reviewer as well, which can be really it's just really valuable, and it can give them a better understanding of one, just what the process is, but then also understanding what it is that is needed to kind of satisfy different criteria. So they're seeing the documentation, they're hearing the things, they're being able to talk with the other reviewers and get a better sense of all of that too.
One thing that I just want to add in terms of what Michelle was talking about meeting the minimum or kind of continuing on is like some are structured in terms of there's a clear floor and like that's all you really need to meet. And then there are incentives that are identified for really high performance, like the things that Michelle identified. One of the things that's emerged in some states that's interesting is that if that floor is really preserved and respected, then there's some ability for authorizers of different stripes to say, well, we do it this way and it's different from how they do it there. But it's okay for us not to have a wholly standardized set of principles, which kind of opens people's eyes to be like, this is not just linear. But establishing that floor is a difficult thing to do and to determine what at a minimum is good. But I do really think that if you're working on a system or developing one that affords people different ways to do it rather than all just steal somebody's, monitoring, and then everybody implemented the exact same way.
Yeah, I think go ahead. You go, Kelly.
I was just going to comment on that. I agree with that completely. I really do think it opens up their eyes to see there's more than one way to feed a bird, right? Skin a cat, whatever you want to say. I think that's really important. I also think, and we've talked a lot about it and spent a lot of time around like the vocabulary or the nomenclature in the and everybody speaking the same language. What does it mean? That we did this past month when we were working? It's like, what does adequate actually mean when we're talking about adequacy, when we're self-reflecting, when we're going to be evaluated? What does that mean? Is it the same? How do we define it, and what does it look like, and what does it not look like? And so we've spent a lot of time on that, trying to quantify that in some way, and how they can show it in different ways. That was a really interesting conversation the last time we.
And one thing, Kelly, to think about, just as you're trying to norm on what definitions are and what all of those things can mean, something that we have done and seen a lot in evaluations is having additional guidance, right? Dave's laughing over there because we've worked on a lot of additional guidance together. And it helps because rubrics are black and white. They are what they are. The terms are there. There's only so many words you can use. And there are going to be nuances. There are going to be specific definitions. And both the reviewers have to understand what that means, and also the authorizers have to understand what that means. So the additional guidance is then a way to go through each standard. You are then really defining kind of what does adequate mean? What do you want to see? What are the types of documentation you want to see? And you go through each of the different levels, and you work your way through all of that. And that way, that's one way of norming. There's always going to be nuances that you don't think of, and that's what comes up during the evaluations. And that's why it's a living document. So even as you're working through it, you have these touch points where you're going through and you're going, what does this actually mean? Well, we saw it over here, but we're seeing it over here. And that's another way of making sure when you have a whole group of reviewers, you are able to then norm. You have a pretty clear idea that you have the same definitions, that you're able to look at things the same way. Sometimes it might mean that I don't know if I really agree with this, but if this is what the group is agreeing with, is what this definition is, and this is how we're looking at this documentation, then at least you have that kind of similar approach to it.
I can't wait for all this evaluating to be helpful. This sounds great. As you get ready to go out and do more and continue what you're already doing, I guess my question to you is, what questions do you have? What do you want to know more about? What are you curious about? What would you like to connect on in the future? So what kind of questions are people coming away with? Go ahead.
Have we seen any of the templates of anyone else's evaluation? Have we brought those together to see what we're evaluating?
We have created a Google folder where I am assembling all the different materials that I can. And so if anybody wants to email to me, I will post it to the folder, and then I'll also give you access to the folder so people can add their own things. So we do have at least that.
I think I begged Tennessee for their stuff at the last conference. My follow-up question is about, it's maybe cart before the horse, but I wanted to ask Lauren about when you mentioned that it was helpful to the smaller authorizers. I don't know. I just wonder about implementation, tips and strategies and experiences with implementation. And also I feel like the other end of the spectrum, which is you went from 70 authorizers to 18, what did that look like? How was that received? It's all good, right, at the end of the day, but I want to know more about the in the moment kind of thing, because I could see where it would not be received well depending on how it was presented here. So that would be.
I will add that in those states where they go from 50 to 70, an individual applicant in any town still has access to 10 or 12 authorizers. So authorizer shopping still exists in Michigan and Minnesota and Ohio. So it's not like Colorado where you're getting rid of the only authorizer. That's not an option if there isn't another. So they were going from way too many to just a lot, is one thing to keep in mind.
One
Lauren?
question I'm curious about is school quality and how that plays into the evaluation. To me, that was to some sense the most important thing. That's what charter schools are about for me, and also the most challenging in a lot of ways for evaluating the authorizer. So I'm curious to hear where folks are on that.
Well, and literally, William, that was the one thing I wanted to get in before we ended, because I feel like personally in my reflections across doing the more summative in multiple states, there's been a shift from pure compliance, do you have it, do you not, to better quality of practices. But quality practices to what end? Like, are these charter schools you're authorizing actually serving students better than their alternative options? Are they actually taking kids no matter what their backgrounds are, right? Like, are SPED students actually being served well in these schools? Like, these bigger questions of so what, to what end is all your authorizing activities? I think a lot of the evals right now are very limited in going there. And I think it'd be great for NN4DA to take a lead on getting there with some of the tools we develop or have influence over, because I do think it needs to go there more moving forward.
Right. I mean, Ohio is the only one that I'm aware of that actually has an academic performance component. It's not overall. They're in the midst of revising. I don't know that will stay in the process. But I think that it is, I mean, why do we do this? But for, academic outcomes for students, right? But authorizers really struggle to see the connection between their high quality authorizing and the outcomes. I don't, but I don't think people start from that perspective.
Other questions, things we haven't gotten to that you're really curious about? Well, we are just about at the end of our time, and I just want to summarize a little bit about what our next steps are. I've been working with Lauren and Michelle on a couple of sort of documents that capture some of the questions you would ask in a self-assessment or a third-party assessment. And we have been assembling a Google folder with all the materials that we can. And part of our intent is to have a monthly phone call amongst those still working on evaluations or that want to just learn about them, where we get together and continue this. I think we're picking the right after the incubator state monthly call, which is usually the first Thursday of the month, but will be the second Thursday this month. So I'll get that time out to you, and we'll continue. I'm really curious. Send me an email with your feedback on this call and whether this has been useful and what else you'd like to know about it. And then before we sign off, I just really want to thank David and William in particular for coming in from outside and sharing their expertise with us. And Lauren and Michelle, I do think we have an incredible amount of knowledge and experience about this at our disposal to take advantage of. So I would point out that David and William remain available to contract with people through their respective firms, and that Lauren and Michelle are also really helpful. So any closing thoughts before we wrap up for today?
Just a big thank you. This is really helpful for us in Wisconsin.
Great. Well, thank you all, and great chatting with you. I thought this was a really fascinating discussion. I learned a lot, and I look forward to finding out what our state partners do with all this sort of crazy stuff. So great to see you.
Thanks for doing this, Alex.
you.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Appreciate your time. Thank you.